Well, week 5, we're finishing out today, and I hope you've enjoyed this series on Stand. Hopefully it hasn't been just informational, it's been transformational, and that's the whole idea. Week 1, we talked about standing out, and Daniel and his young friends were taken captive from Israel. They were taken out of Jerusalem there, watched their families get slaughtered in front of them, and they're ripped out, taken hundreds of miles away to Babylon, and there they had to stand out, and that was the tricky part. And then week 2 we talked about standing up, and Daniel learned how to stand up to a king in his adult years, probably in his late 40s, early 50s. Learned how to stand up to the king and tell a king in a loving way, in the right way, how to live his life. And then week 3 we talked about standing strong. We looked at that famous story of Daniel in the lion's den, and how Daniel is in his 80s now, and he's working for a different king, and he gets sort of tricked into this, and he had to learn how to stand strong. And then last week, week 4, I enjoyed last week. Week 4, we looked at standing in faith. When you think God doesn't hear you, what do you do? And that's the question we answered. We saw how it worked in Daniel's life, how God lifted him up, and God's always working. He heard our prayers the very first time we prayed, and that's the great thing. And this week we're going to finish it out. And this week we're working backwards, because the first 4 weeks we talked specifically about Daniel, included his friends. This week we're going to talk about Daniel's friends and not Daniel, and we're going back to a very familiar story. And I always say this, whenever you're dealing with very familiar stories, they sort of, I don't always like to preach on the familiar stories, because people sort of tune you out and go, oh, I've heard this one before. So please don't do that today, even though you probably know the story as well as anybody. Look for what God's speaking this. But in our whole series, what we've learned is this idea of stand has been throughout the whole book of Daniel. And if you take a stand in the right way, at the right reasons, at the right time, doing it in the right ways, it can change the course and direction of our lives. Had Daniel not taken the correct stand, had he done something different, there would be no book of Daniel. There would be no story about the lion's den. There would be no Hebrew children going through the fiery furnace. There'd be none of those things. And Daniel stands out because his lifespan, from his teenage years all the way into late in life, 90 years old, Daniel was a model of how to stand in courage, not just to take a stand so he could yell at people and picket and protest everything. He didn't do that. Daniel took a right direction in his life and course because he stood up in the right way. He stood out in the right way. He stood strong in the right way. And today we're going to look at how you can stand firm. But we also know this, the opposite of standing up would be compromise. And if you compromise in the wrong way at the wrong times for the wrong reasons, it can cost you way more than you can imagine. And that's what the whole issue is today. How do we take a stand? Because we are come down to, in Christianity, how to take a stand the right way or compromise in the wrong way. And that's really what's a problem. And we get to this familiar, we're going to be in the book of Daniel today, in Daniel chapter 3. And what we find out as you're thinking about this story that's so familiar to us about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, what we realize here is that we all go through fires in our life, don't we? We all have problems. If you thought coming to know Jesus as your Savior meant a problem-free life, you were mistaken. In fact, Jesus even said it this way over in John chapter number 16. Jesus said in John 16:33, he said, I told you these things. Now, the backdrop of this is he's been speaking on his death and betrayal and crucifixion and eventually his resurrection, how he's going to go away from them. He's talking to his disciples the night before he's betrayed. And he says, I've told you all these things so that you may have peace. Secret there is the only way you get peace is in Jesus Christ. That's the only way. Because he says, and this is the sad part for us, in this world, this is the promise Jesus made to you and me as disciples of Jesus, in this world, you will have trouble. So if you're not having any trouble in life, you may not be a follower of Jesus Christ. And I tell you this much, it's a promise that Jesus gave you. So you can say, well, I'm free of problems. No, you're supposed to have troubles. You are targeted for trouble. But the good news is Jesus didn't finish it there. He says, but take heart, be of good cheer. Some of the translations say that, because I have overcome the world. And that's a promise before he even gets on the cross. He says, I have overcome the world. He's looking prophetically. He understands the whole idea. But you are going to have trouble. And somebody convinced you that when you prayed a prayer, when you came forward in church, when you got baptized, when you just joined the church, that your life was trouble-free, they lied. You ought to go back to them and say, you're a liar. Because I'm not here to tell you that. I'm not here to tell you that everything's going to be roses and ponies. Okay, I don't know why those two would go together, but roses and ponies aren't going to happen today. You are going to have problems. And I think most of us here in this room fit in one of three categories. And you've probably heard these categories before. You're either going into a problem, you're in the middle of a problem, or you're just leaving a problem. But our lives are always about troubles. It's that point where in the book of Job, Job says, as a campfire, as the sparks of a campfire go upward, man is born unto troubles. Just the same way. We always see it coming. There's problems in your life. And if you're going to try and chase a life of problem-free living, it's not available. It's just not going to happen. The way of mankind is trouble. Now, that's so gloom, doom, despair. I put a smile on your face today. You got to put a smile on your face. Because I know this is a heavy lesson we're talking about today. But I don't want to lie to you. Peter said it this way, and Peter had gone through so many different things in his life, but Peter put it this way over in his writings. He said in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 7, and he's talking about the struggles of life. He says, these have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, your faith, that's the core of your belief in Jesus Christ, your faith of greater worth than gold. You may have never thought about this. And I don't understand why churches aren't more full, because the greatest thing, according to the Bible, is not all the things you own, not gold, silver, or money, or your 401k, or anything else. The greatest thing you have is the genuineness of your faith. Your life in Christ is more rich than anything out there. And he says it's more greater than worth in gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, because it may result, this faith of yours may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. And he's not talking about necessarily just the coming of Jesus Christ. He's talking about the revelation of Jesus Christ in your life. That's what he's saying here. And that's the purpose of the fires in your life. But to be honest with you, I don't care about the purposes, Because when I'm in the midst of a fire, when I'm in the midst of trouble, when I'm in the midst of problems, I hate it. And I get to this point where I feel like most of you, because most of you here, you may be battling something that's greater than yourself. Maybe it was like last week when we talked about the feeling of unanswered prayer. Or maybe you've got criticism in your life. Maybe you've got problems at work. You lost a job. You've got a job you don't like. Maybe you've got health issues. Those are always overwhelming, aren't they? Financial issues, challenges, strained relationships. We know a lot about those. You're not getting along with your husband. You're not getting along with your wife. You're not getting along with your in-laws, your outlaws. The kids are a problem. Everybody's a problem. Maybe it's your friends. You're having all these. We get to these points in our lives where discouragement overcomes you, and maybe you've been living like that. I feel sometimes waves of discouragement come over me, and then they lead to depression, which can lead you down a dark path. And maybe you've been there. Maybe you're in that path right now. And the question that we're going to answer today, the question that you need to ask yourself is, what do you do? What do you do when you're in the middle of that furnace? What do you do when you're in the middle of the fires of life? What do you do? I've told you that you're going to have trouble. I've told you that there's problems coming, or you're in the middle of a problem, or you're just leaving one. What do you do when you're in the furnace? Because how we respond, and this is what the picture is today, how we respond to the problems of life is so vitally important, so huge in our life. And today, as we get into this, I think about this. Normally I wait until the end of a message to give you that one takeaway truth, but I'm going to give it to you right up front. And here it is. A faith that's tested is a faith that can be trusted. Did you get that? If you take notes, you want to write that down. A faith that is tested is a faith that can be trusted. And remember what Peter said. He said it's more precious than gold because it's going to be revealed in your life. The glory of Jesus Christ will be revealed in your life through the problems that you go through. That's why you have the problems. Remember the man born blind, John chapter 9? And the disciples came in and said, who sinned? Was it him or his parents that he was born blind? And Jesus said, neither. He said it was because of the glory of God that this man's blind. It's for God's glory. And you know what you go through? When you go through cancer, you go through COVID, you go through losses of jobs, bad relationships, all those things, you know what? God's giving you an opportunity to have something in your life that's more precious than gold. The revelation of Jesus Christ through those circumstances that are tough. And a faith that's tested is a faith that can be trusted. Yet we don't like to be tested, do we? I mean, that's just the bottom line. We don't like that at all. And you know what? It's true because testing is awful hard. Really is. Daniel chapter 3, we know the famous story here. The background of Daniel chapter 3, just so you remember, King Nebuchadnezzar, bad king. And when I say bad king, think Saddam Hussein or really probably Hitler. That would be equals, contemporaries, right? Not contemporaries, but equals on their path. And this guy has murdered and worked his way as an evil man. Don't be confused when you read the Bible and think, maybe he's a good guy. He's not a good guy. He's a bad guy. He kills the parents of these kids, all their relatives, and then takes them, renames them, and puts them into Babylonian culture because he didn't trust the people that he was related to. He didn't trust all of his friends. So he thought he could get some people that he could program into being his followers. And in Daniel chapter 3, we find this guy, this egomaniac, who's a wicked ruler, and here he is, and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego are very young. I read a couple of books where they said that they probably were still in their late teenage years, but I think they probably were in their 20s, no later than their 20s. That's probably the biggest consensus. So you get to Daniel chapter 3, and what happens here is this guy, Nebuchadnezzar, to get an idea of what kind of guy he was, he takes the national treasury and melts it down, not all of it, but a good portion of it, and makes a 90-foot statue of himself. 90 foot tall by 9 foot wide. 90 foot tall by 9 foot wide. He had some issues in his life, right? He needed somebody to respect him. So he builds this golden statue, puts it out there in the plains, and invites all of the government to come in, all of his rulers to come in. Of course, Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego are three of these guys. And they're come in, and then we find in Daniel chapter 3 and verse 4, instructions are given. So it says there, then the herald loudly proclaimed, and this is what he said, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. So right away you see it's not a request, it's an order. He goes on, verse 5, and he says, as soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must, and there again that word must, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Ultimatum is given. The ultimatum of you have to do this. Verse 6, he goes on to say, whoever, this is what's going to happen when you don't, whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. And you know right away as you're reading this, you're thinking, uh-oh. I mean, uh-oh. Isn't that an uh-oh? Did you ever run into uh-oh problems? You're at the doctor and you had your checkup and the doctor says, hey, we found something that's not right. And in your mind, you may not say it out loud, but you say, uh-oh, uh-oh. You get a note that says your boss needs to see you. And you're thinking, uh-oh, this can't be good. Or your kids come and say, hey, we need to talk. And you're thinking, this is never good. And the words that come to mind probably are, uh-oh, 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 this can't be good. It's as a pastor, you know what happens is somebody comes up and says, hey, I need to talk to you. We already talked about this before, right? And so I sit there and in my mind, I'm like, uh-oh, what did I do? What's wrong? You know? And we immediately start seeing the fire build up, the furnaces, the bad situations. And you know this isn't going to be good. It's going to be a bad thing here. And you're just ready for it. And that's what happens. The music's supposed to play, and you're supposed to fall down and bow. But that's not what the title of this series is it? The title of the series is Stand, right? Stand. And this is the ultimate stand here, isn't it? Everybody needs to bow down, but three guys. And maybe you're thinking, hey, I can hide. Hey, I can just No, that's not what happens here. Skip down verse 12. It says, but this is what happens. The music's played, they don't bow, and they're reported by the other guys who are jealous of them, who are envious of their jobs, and this is what they go back to the king and say, but there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. And in case you didn't know who they were, let's be specific. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which when you say that, that automatically means the king knew who these were. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had such a good reputation with the king, and these other governors, these guys who were reporting them, they want to do some damage here. So let's talk about Shadrach, and Meshach, and Abednego. Let's tell the king what his bad choice made him. And they go on to claim, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They get personal with it, don't they? King, these guys that you love, these guys that you trusted, you set up, they pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that do you see all these pointed you have set up. Verse 13 says, furious with rage. This is the reaction. You can see this fury is what selfish people do, and the yous are thrown on them, right? Nebuchadnezzar, what does he do? He's furious with rage. He summons Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. Verse 14 says, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true? Is it true? Say it's not true. Say it's not so. That's what hey, you guys, I invested all this time in you. I've made you my disciples. I've made you what you are today. Say it's not true. And that was the plea. Of course, you know it is true. Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, say it's not true that you did not serve, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up. Say it's not true. In verse 15, he says, just in case you missed it, now when you hear the sound of the, and I don't know why they were so caught up on listing every musical instrument. They could have just said the band, right? But he says, now when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music, if you're ready. Doesn't that sound so polite? If you're ready. Maybe you got it wrong, but if you're ready, if you've got everything set in your mind, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, well, very good. We're okay with each other. No problems. But, that's a big but in the Bible there, right? But if you do not worship it, and this is where Nebuchadnezzar's not such a nice guy, he says, if you do not worship it, you thought you had a choice, but if you don't worship it, right? You will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. And notice what he finishes out. This is the key thought here. Then, this is how arrogant Nebuchadnezzar was. Then, what God? What did he just do? He elevated him on a plane of all the other gods. He says, then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Do you see how powerful he feels? He has put himself on a plane where I'm the equal of a God. And you better do what I said because your life hangs in my hand. And sometimes we sit back when our bosses threaten us with things, when our relationships feel like they're threatened. Your spouse says divorce is possible. Kids say, hey, I'm leaving. I'm walking out on you. And you sit back and you shake. And the government says your bank account's going to fail. The economy's not going to be good. And you go, uh-oh. And you feel so threatened. You feel like that furnace has just gotten heated up. And life becomes tough. What do you do? What do you do then? Today we want to talk about three qualities. And I'm just going to go through these pretty quick. Three qualities of standing in faith, standing firm in faith. How do you stand firm in your faith? And I believe that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego give us some timeless truths that really fit us. And hopefully you'll be able to grab these. Number one, faith obeys God instead of following man. So they're given an ultimatum. They're told, you must, or you're going to be thrown into a furnace. And you know you won't survive there. In fact, the last thing the king says, hey, no God can stop me. No God can get you rescued. No God is capable of saving your life from me. I run your life. Isn't that how the world depicts things? You face a government that says, I run you, I own you. No, they don't. They tried to tell us we can't pray in certain places. We can't do that. Really? I think we can. But we've learned through the series is you've got to pick the right ways to do it in the right times for the right reasons. And here's another ultimatum that he's given these 3 Hebrew children. Hey, you have to bow down when God says stand up. And you know what? Faith, our real faith, a true faith in God, obeys God instead of following man. Look at the verse number 16. Now remember, they're having this conversation, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to this king. And in case you were wondering here, this isn't a surly, smart-mouthed teenager, young adult who's using some modern-day languages, throwing it back in his face. They are as polite as possible. In fact, I think the English version doesn't do it very good justice. In the original languages, it is a very, very humble answer that they give him here. And they say, King Nebuchadnezzar, I know you just gave us this whole information. I know you threw this on us and you're expecting us to think about this because you know we're wise men for you. We're very intelligent guys. We're some of the best at thinking things through. But they say this, we do not need to defend ourselves. Hey, you know what? You Christian, don't need to defend yourself. You don't have to worry when hey, you know what? When you see the news and you hear things about, hey, they're going to make this law and that law against Christianity, and they're going to do all these things against our faith. Hey, you know what? You don't need to defend yourselves. You just need to listen to God. You don't have to follow man, follow God. That's the whole idea here. He says, we don't need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. It's simple. We have learned that we just need to follow God. We need to follow God. You know, I love that they didn't need to defend themselves. You know what? They didn't have to explain everything in their life to Nebuchadnezzar. But he's the king. Yeah, that's fine. They respected him. They were genuinely respectful of his position. They knew that God had allowed him to be in charge, and they were servants to him, and they did the best job they could. But he did not own them. That's why they didn't need to defend themselves. And I love the fact that they didn't go, hey, can you give us some time, Nebuchadnezzar? We need to make a list. We're going to weigh the pros and the cons and see which would be better. Should we stand or should we kneel? They didn't do that. Notice that they didn't go on Facebook or any other social media and go, hey, can I get some advice? What should we do in this situation? They didn't do that. They didn't, hey, you know what? They didn't even pull the Christian card and go, hey, give me a minute, preacher. I need to pray about this. You know why? Because real faith follows God and doesn't follow man. And you don't have to pray about things God's given you a command for. Did you hear me on that one? You don't have to pray about things God has commanded you to do. You know what? You don't have to pray about joining the church. You know that? God expects you to. You don't have to pray about getting baptized. You don't have to pray about should I witness or not. Those are things that you're given commands to do in the Bible. You know what? You don't have to pray about should I give or not, because God says it's blessed to give. It's more blessed to give than to receive. That's true. See, Christians have learned this whole like, hey, just tell somebody I'm going to pray about it. Should you serve God? Hey, you know what? Today's the day all of our Christian service surveys are due today, right? Hey, you're supposed to serve God. Did you know that? It is. It's your reasonable service is what Paul says over in Romans chapter 12, unless it's changed. Did somebody change that in the Bible? I know it's like, oh man, he's talking about things I don't like. It's true. And yet Christians go, well, let me pray about it. Let me pray about it. God put you here to glorify him, not to glorify you. You're supposed to serve. Whatever talent he gave you, you're supposed to use it for his glory. That's the truth. And you know what? If you don't do it voluntarily, he's going to turn up the heat on you a little bit more, and the fire is going to get a little hotter, and it's going to be a lot harder to serve him. But he's going to get what he needs out of you. He will. God will. That's his purpose. You can't change his purpose. And what I love about this is the fact that they realized that they had a plan ahead of time. And what was their plan? The plan for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is so simple. Obedience. Obedience. Hey, we're going to obey God. We're going to obey God because faith follows God, not man. And what I love about this is something we've already been talking about here. It was a predetermined plan. Hey, predetermined. They didn't have to wait till the alarm went off on Sunday morning to go, hey, should we go to church or not? Predetermined plan. That would be revolutionary, wouldn't it? Oh, I can't get up early, preacher. Hey, you know what? I bet you could if it was something you wanted to do. It's true. There's plenty of things I've gotten up early for that I really, really want to do. So I should change my idea to start following God instead of following man. You see, think about how easy it would have been to rationalize a different plan for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Man, hey, let's just hide out in the bathroom while the music's going on. Nobody will know, right? You know what I'm saying? Let's just not hang out with anybody else so nobody sees us, and then we won't have to do it. We could have rationalized, and we talked about this in the Lion's Den episode, right? It would have been easy for Daniel not to pray. It would have been easy for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego just to go ahead and bend. After all, God needs us to be alive in order to serve him. That wasn't their idea. They had already made the decision. In fact, they made the decision when they were 14, 15 years old to serve God then, and it didn't change. And let me just tell you, young people, really anybody in here, but young people, it's even harder on you guys. I know it is. I know it when all your friends are out doing alcohol, when all your friends are out smoking, drinking, vaping now, I think is the big thing. And when all your friends are doing it, it's going to be hard to make that decision not to. That's why you need to make it before you go out with them. Make the hard decisions early. Hey, you know what? It's hard to keep yourself pure in this day and age, isn't it? You know how you do that? Make a decision beforehand. Parents, hey, you know, parents, you ought to make a covenant agreement with your kids. I remember years ago they used to have the purity agreement, right? The purity rings you give your girls. Hey, it's still a great thing. I know it's not cool anymore, but it still would be cool in God's eyes. It's an awesome thing. Hey, you know what? You got to pre-decide those things. Pre-decisions are the best way to go here. And I promise you this, and this is so important here. I promise you, if you are committed to serving God, listen carefully. If you are committed to serving God with your life, Satan will give you ample opportunities to compromise your commitment. Do you hear me on that one? If you are committed to serving God, you know what? And that's what I love about it. No, I don't really. What I hated about COVID, you know what COVID did for us? COVID's become a tool of Satan because it's given people an ample opportunity not to serve God anymore. Well, you know, we might get COVID if we go to church. Do you go to Walmart? If you went to Walmart, you're probably going to get COVID there. It's probably not any different than going to church. Hopefully, I know the people here. I think we're a lot cleaner and probably wash our hands a little bit more, but nonetheless. You know what I'm saying? Come on. Are you guys there today? Let's be honest with ourselves. I know it's not always easy to hear the word of God, but it's true. Satan will give us ample opportunities. You know why church attendance has fallen way off? And I'm not just talking Maple, I'm talking all across the world. COVID. Because COVID's become a tool of Satan. Because Satan will give you, if you're trying to serve God, Satan will give you opportunities, ample opportunities to compromise your commitment to God. Now, there was a day and age when I saw people who I never thought would not go to church. Hey, Satan will give you every tool, every reason. Oh, you know, you're not feeling good, you're sick, you're doing this, you're doing that. He's going to give you opportunities to do all kinds of stuff. He's going to discourage you. And you know what? Do you think that 3 young adults in their 20s weren't a little nervous when they stood before a king who says, hey, you know what? If you don't bow this time, I'm going to end your life. They committed, first of all, their faith to serving God, following God, not man. Number 2, faith believes in spite of what it sees. Did you get that? True faith believes in spite of what it sees. Because you got to realize that day, it was pretty ominous. When Nebuchadnezzar's talking about this fiery furnace, he wasn't talking about we're going to build one eventually, and maybe 5-10 years after taxes pay for it, we'll have a furnace. No, the furnace was right there. When he's speaking about it, they were actually stoking it with some wood, coal, whatever they were using. It was right there. Can you just imagine this king going, hey, you see that? You don't bend this time, I'm putting you in there. You won't make it. But faith believes in spite of what it sees. And that's what's great about it. Verse 17, this is what they understood, and this is where we see it. Verse 17, they're continuing their answer to the king in a respectful way. They say, if, that might be a word you want to circle, highlight, or whatever, if, the big if of life. If You know why? I love that because it's the same doubt that maybe we have in our lives. Maybe God will, maybe God won't. If God lets things happen that I don't want to have happen in my life, what am I going to do? And that's what they're saying here. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, if. And when you get honest about the ifs of your life, you'll be able to serve the God of your life so much better. You know that? Stop being so scared about everything. Because God gave you whatever you got. You know, if you got cancer, God gave it to you. You say, that's so awful. No, he did. God gave it to you not to hurt you, but to help you, because he figured that the cancer was going to make you better. What are you going to do with the cancer you got? God put you in all the circumstances of your life. He is sovereign. When he gave Johnny, hey, Johnny, when you got COVID, God gave it to you. You ought not to be upset about it. He gave it to you. It was a gift to you. It's not the gift you may have wanted, but it is a gift you needed. Because they understood, if God goes ahead and gives me the gift of the blazing furnace, notice what they say next, and this is the crux of it. The God we serve is able. The God we serve is able. Everybody say that with me. The God we serve is able. Do you believe that? That would be a game changer when you go to the doctor for something like cancer, COVID, something that's a major problem. And before you walk into that room, before you talk to that doctor, you say, you know what, the God we serve is able. The God we serve is able what? The God we serve is able to deliver us from it. Furnace, not a problem, because the God I serve is able. That's faith, isn't it? That's faith at a whole nother level. That's a faith that's so exponentially better than anything we got. Why? You can see that furnace, but faith says, you know what? I'm going to believe God in spite of what I see. The God we serve is able to deliver us from it. Furnaces aren't a big deal. Cancer's not a big deal. Bad relationships aren't a big deal. Whatever the biggest problem in your life is right now, and I'm not trying to minimize it at all, but when you hold it up to the God who is able, it is nothing. And notice what they say. He is able to deliver us from it, and he will. That's some positive thinking. You ever talk to discouraging people? Unfortunately, I have to talk to a lot of different kind of people, and there are people that, man, you talk to them, you're like, oh, get ready, here it comes. And they just start, boo-hoo, boo-hoo, it's nothing good, everything's bad. And it just, doesn't it just suck the life, maybe I'm the only one. Sometimes it sucks the life out of me. And I just come home deflated, and I'm thinking, man, God is able to deliver us from it. This is some young people who have some extraordinary faith, and they don't stop there. They say, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. Now, when they say that, think about what they're saying here. They didn't know that how God was going to save them. I know, you've already read the story, you've heard it before. It's a cool story, but they didn't know because they're still going through it. Think about what they're saying here. He will deliver us. And notice they didn't say what I would have thought. They didn't say he will deliver us from the fiery furnace. What did they say? They said, hey, Nebuchadnezzar, he will deliver us from your hand. What was the last threat that the king made? He said, what God will be able to deliver you from my... Yeah, they knew what he was saying, and he knew what they were saying. Your hand isn't as big as God's hand. And our God is able, and he will, when they say that, he may let us go through the fire. He may let us die, but he's going to take us from your hand because you don't control our lives. God does. You know what? You can wash 300 times a day. You can use hand sanitizers. You can be injected with every vaccination on the planet. But you know what? God's the one who's going to give you or not give you COVID. Do you hear me? You don't control that. You don't control that. You control nothing. The only thing you control in life is your faith in God. And when you have a faith that knows that God is able to deliver you, how big is cancer? right? Paul would say it in a different way. Paul would say, hey, for me to live is Christ, but to die, come on, that's my gain. That's big news for me. Go ahead, kill me. Go ahead, take my life, because I would rather be in his presence because it's a better life there. And that's what he understood. And faith believes in spite of what we see. And I tell you, that's a game changer for us in our lives, because when you look at this world today and you see how corrupt our politics in America are, how bad our economy is, how bad the world is falling apart, natural disasters, wars, rumors of wars, and you sit back and go, oh my goodness, is this really the life I live in, the time I live in? This isn't a good time. But you know what? God is able to deliver us from the hand of Satan, from the hand of evil, from the hand of this corrupt world. He is able to deliver us. Number 3, and last of all, faithful obedience is our responsibility, but the outcome is God's. Did you get that? Faithful obedience is our responsibility. The outcome is God's. You don't have to make the outcome work. They didn't have to come up with a plan to stop the furnace. How are we going to blow out the pilot light? You know, they didn't have to come up with that plan. How are we going to be the Houdini of our day and escape this? You don't have to do that. All God has called you and me to do is follow him. Follow him. You know, in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, where he talks about being witnesses, the word witnesses in the original language is the same word that we use for the word martyr. God, when he called the disciples in that first church to go out and tell all the world about him, he said, hey, go and be martyrs for me. They knew when they stepped out into the streets of Jerusalem that they were going to die. Every one of the original apostles, minus John, because John died a natural death because he was just too stubborn to die the way the world wanted him to. They boiled him in oil and all kinds of different things. John died of old age. Every one of them, though, they knew when they walked out, to be a witness meant to die for God. And all they had to do was be obedient, because that's their responsibility. You know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were already about that, weren't they? Their plan was obedience, and they had already predetermined their plan. They just left the outcome in God's hand. You see, in verse number 18, they go on to say, but even if he does not. That's just a great point there. Even if God doesn't save my life, we want you to know, your majesty. Even if things don't work out the way we hope, we think, we want you to know. Here, this is for certain. And we're not being ugly, we're not being rude, we're not being disrespectful to you, but we want you to know there is no possibility that we will serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. That's pretty strong. In fact, that's so strong that that's going to require a reaction from the king, you know? And once again, that's not a big deal. When you and I read it, we're like, yeah, that's good, he said that, but I already know it's going to happen. They, when they said it, didn't know what was going to happen. That's what's great about God. He had them right where he wanted them. They were living that life of faith, and it was an intense faith. And when you live that life, you see God do some extraordinary things. You know that. One of the reasons you may not see things like that is you may not have the faith to trust God that he will deliver you even through a furnace. That's just the truth. The reaction, though, is crazy. They didn't know it was going to happen, but the king did, and he was pretty upset. The king ordered the furnace, turned it up a little bit. In fact, he says, turned it up 7 times hotter than it's ever been. And he ordered the strongest of his soldiers to go, and this never made any sense to me, but they're going to bind up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I don't know. Why do you have to bind them up? You're throwing them in a fire that's hotter 7 times. Are you worried that they're going to have a party in there? You worried they're going to like break dance or something? I don't know what he was worried about, but you got to bind them up. You got to, and really I think it's a picture of our lives, because that's what Satan does to us, right? Satan starts binding you up. God wants to set you free. Satan says, you know what, I'm heating that fire up 7 times hotter. I'm going to make it more intense in your life than you ever thought it could be. And he orders these strong men to take you and throw you in. And they threw in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And what's amazing, the strongest of the strong, they don't even get in the fire, but they die throwing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire. And so you know that that fire is real. You know how scary it is. In verse 24 says, then King Nebuchadnezzar, as he's watching this fire situation go on, he doesn't see what he expected. He's shocked. In fact, it says he leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his smart advisors there, weren't there 3 men? Weren't there three men that we tied up and we threw into the furnace, into the fire? And they replied, certainly, Your Majesty. They had that under wraps. They could count to 3. And the king says in verse 25, he said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire. Now, I know we always focus on the 4, but people walking around in the fire, that's pretty unusual, right? I don't know, but had anybody taken any walks through I've seen guys who do the walk on hot burning coals. I think that's crazy enough, but to walk in a fire, walking around in a fire, having a stroll, getting their steps on. I don't know if they had the little tracking steps to make sure they got their 10,000 steps in that day, but man, they were just walking around, and they were unbound and unharmed. And then the king says this. He says the 4th looks like the son of the gods. Now, some of the translations do a poor job to it and says the son of God. You think right away he knows what God looks like. He knows what Jesus looks like. That's not what he's saying. He's going on what he imagines the gods that he serves look like. He says, this guy is brilliant. He's something different. He's like the sons of the gods. And that's where you find him. And here's what you need to understand. God will show you his power in all kinds of different ways throughout the course of your life. But, and catch me out here on this one, but you will know his presence, the tangible reality of the presence of Christ. You'll know it best when you're in the fire of your life. You'll know the presence of God more intensely, and that's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would tell you today. Hey, you know what? We just trusted God for the outcome. You know what? We spent some good time. I don't know. I wonder what they did in that fire. Do you think they got a chance to ask God? You think they got a chance? They had time to walk around. Maybe hey, what should we do? What's going on? What's the next step? We got to remember in our own lives, don't minimize what the presence of God in the circumstances of your hurt will accomplish. Don't minimize that. You will go through trouble. You are going to get into a fire situation. You're going to be put in an awkward situation that's so hard in your life. Don't minimize the presence of God in that. It's the only way you're going to make it through. It's the power of God. And you know what? It's great. He's going to pull you out unbound and unharmed. That's what he does. In the second half of verse 27, all the guys that are gathered around that are advising the king, they look in, and this is what they say. Notice what they say in verse 27, the second half of it. This is what they saw. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Unscathed, nothing changed. They were maybe better off. They were unbound and unharmed. And make sure you understand they were clear of anything that resembled the trial in their life. That's what was amazing. And I think what you have to realize, they didn't bend and they didn't bow because of that, God wouldn't let them burn. God had their back. God had the outcome, and I think so often we're trying to predetermine the outcomes, and God didn't call you to manipulate the circumstances of your life. You don't have to figure it. You just have to trust God through it. You just have to be the reflection of God. You have to obediently serve God, and he may put you through the worst furnace of your life. He may deliver you, but he may just let you go through it. He may save your life, but he may let you burn. He may. Because it's his purpose. And his purpose is to bring himself glory through your life. And whatever give him the greatest glory. Which brings us to that whole idea that we better start thinking about it. Because what happens here is these three guys, they come out so different really than the outcome expected, that the rest of the world, these guys who didn't believe in God, Jehovah, they marveled and they realized that there was something different about them and the God they served. Because you know what? Nobody was trusting their God to take them into that furnace other than Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They weren't trusting the gods of Babylon to do that. And you know what's great? Some of you sitting here, you've been through some of the worst problems in your life and nobody knows. And that's what's great about it. Nobody knows. See, nobody would have known. If you hadn't been there that day, nobody would have known that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went through a fire. That's what God does for you, isn't it? He takes you out, not so you get the attention, but that he. And you know what's great about it? Nobody would have known, but they knew that God was with them in the fire. See, when God shows up in your hurt, the world looks on, and you know who gets the glory? God does. When your faith is the kind of faith that helps you stand firm through the furnace and the fires of your life. Because we end with this, as we think about it. In Daniel chapter 3, verse 28 says that Nebuchadnezzar said, "Oh me, didn't work. We got to figure out a better furnace." That's not what he said. His whole outlook was different. Now, he never accepted God. He never fell and realized that God was the only God. That's been the story of Nebuchadnezzar's life. But notice what he does see. Because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went through the fire of their life, and they survived by trusting God and telling a king to his face, "King, you don't control our destiny, God does." King Nebuchadnezzar ends up turning around. He says, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." So he didn't accept him as his God. Praise be to the God who has sent his angel, his messenger, and rescued his servants. And notice this. He goes on and says in verse 28, they, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they trusted him. Do you trust God? Next time you're in the worst situation in your life, do you trust God? Because God is still able. Do you trust God? They trusted him and defied the king. This is the king saying it. They defied me. They defied the king's command and were willing. Do you get that? Greatest statement about that you can make. This is the testimony of the lives of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were willing to give up their lives. What are you willing to give up for God? They were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any God except their own God, the true God. You know why? Because a faith that is tested is a faith that can be trusted. That's the bottom line.